Greetings! It is I, Tantus Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on the history of Magic the Gathering, where I take you from set to set explaining the history. I apologize if I found it sound a little funny. I have a very bad cold. I'm going to be recording a few episodes still while having this cold. I'm hoping it's not going to do enough to interfere with everything. Let's continue where we left off with Nemesis. Now, Nemesis was released on February 14th of 2000. It was the second set in the Mercadian Masques blocks, the first small set within that block. It had 143 cards and continued all the themes and keywords that were before with spell shapers, alternate cost cards, mercenaries, and rebels, but introduced laccoliths, seals, and a new keyword, fading. Now, the set's symbol was of an axe, representing Krovax and his axe, being the main antagonist of the Rath portion of this entire storyline. Now, as I said, it continued many of the themes that were in Mercadian Masques, but it is considered the most powerful set in the entire Masques block, actually. One unique thing is Ascendant Evencar. This legend actually represents an entirely another version of a legend previously released. Previously, we had seen a version of Krovax come out in legendary format. This was a version of him once again released, and they managed to avoid the legend rule for this by having him named Ascendant Evencar and not mentioning that his name is Krovax. Now, they did go back on this entire thing in the future when it came to Invasion, where they had an alternate version of Urtai, who they had already printed in the earlier blocks also. It is also known for having Rootwater Thief, which was Mike's long invitational card, that he won the ability to have a card in the set. Rootwater Thief was in it. Now, it had 15 card boosters, featuring the art of Sliptide Surfeit. It also had 4 pre-constructed decks and a fat pack. Now, the pre-release was on February 5th of 2000, and the pre-release card was Rath the Assassin. It also featured a novel of the same name, Nemesis, that came out accompanying it. Now, the storyline shows that in the absence of Volrath's control over Rath, that after everything that happened with the Leatherlight Clue, that he basically had moved away, Phyrexians are now still looking towards using Rath in order to invade Dominaria. Of course, this means that Yawgmoth's plans requires a new Evencar be put in place, a new ruler over the plane. They look to a number of candidates, including Krovax, and give him great new bits of power, basically instill him with new abilities, and many of his others that are there. And then they basically have them compete for control, of which, of course, Krovax is the one that ends up on top. In the meantime, the rebels of Rath, led by Eladrimi, the Lord of Leaves, continue to unite and build up their forces to face against the Phyrexian threat that's controlling this demi-plane. Now, a number of cards from the set are actually known to have been important on the tournament scene during this time, including Daze. It also introduced the keyword Fading. Fading was a special ability that a creature would come into play with a number of fade counters. Effectively, you could pay less for it, and in each turn, it would lose a phase counter. When it would run out of them, you'd basically get rid of it. So you'd have a creature for a temporary part in time, usually for less cost than it would be for something of the power that it was. So it was cheaper, but it would be limited use of it. Basically, you'd have it for only a limited amount of time. Now, there were 4 cycles in this block and 2 vertical cycles. So the cycles were, of course, a cycle of seals. These were cheap enchantments that you'd put out into play, and you could sacrifice that would mimic very common instant effects. Effectively, I could play it out and play, and then I'd have it for any time I want that I could sacrifice it and have its instant effect. It had a cycle of free spells, in which if you had a land of the appropriate type, you could cast this spell for free. Added a cycle of spell shapers, common ones that, of course, just like spell shapers from the last set, you could discard a card to them to get an effect, to mimic the effect of a spell. And then it had a cycle of tribal rebels / mercenaries. These were creatures that would have the ability to search for a certain type of tribe and put them into play. So rather than just being rebels and mercenaries, there were goblins, elves, and merfolk that they would search for and effectively put into play then. So there was a cycle of them. The vertical cycles were first a green vertical cycle that had creatures that when you would put them into play, you could search your library for up to 3 copies of that creature, reveal them, and put them into your hand. So it's effectively propagating creatures that you could get 1 of them, and then you could get up to 3 copies of them in the same time. The other vertical cycle was, of course, of laccoliths. Laccoliths having a unique ability that once they are blocked, they can, rather than deal combat damage, you can have them deal their damage to target creature in play. So effectively, they redirect their damage before normal damage would be dealt entirely to something else. Of course, they can still do it to the creature that's blocking them, making laccoliths very dangerous and hard to deal with, but they are a very interesting cycle of them that existed. Now, there was a cycle of creatures that lasted across a number of sets that was completed with this one. Voice of Truth was released here, and it was the final angel in a set of 5 angels that had gone across some of the Urza saga before, that each of them had protection from a certain color. So now, with this one's released, the set is complete, and you could have all 5 angels that each one has protection from a different color. It had a number of paired cards, including Lawbringer and Lightbringer, which exiled black and red creatures, respectively, and then also had a pair that was Rackling and Viceling, 2 creatures that represented Black Vice and the Rack, each giving their same abilities but also being creatures. It also had a pair in Stronghold Biologist and Stronghold Mechanist that were spell shapers that you could discard a card to counter a spell, one of them for creatures, the other for non-creature spells. Now, there were a number of functional reprints, including Spineless Thug for Craven Knight. Now, the pre-constructed decks were a blue-green called Breakdown, and a red-white called Eruption, a black deck called Mercenaries, and a black-green deck called Replica. Now, let's talk about some of the cards from this set. There was Ancestral Knowledge. When you played it, you would draw a card. Then, you would draw a card for each Ancestral Knowledge in all graveyards. So if there was a lot of people playing with Ancestral Knowledge, you would draw a lot of cards. There was Ether Barrier. Ether Barrier, when a player would play a creature spell, they would have to pay 1 colorless or sacrifice a permanent, their choice. There was Ascendant Evankar, which I talked about earlier. He's a 3/3 flyer, where other black creatures get +1/+1, and non-black creatures get -1/-1. There's Bellbase Portal. When it comes into play, you choose a creature type. Then you can tap 3, tap it, put a creature of the chosen type from your hand into the battlefield. So it's basically you're putting things into play from your hand if they are creatures of the type that you chose with Bellbase Porter. Pretty good for a tribal deck. There's Blinding Angel, a 2/4 flyer. If it deals combat damage to a player, on their next turn, they are unable to attack. So it's an angel creature that you can smack someone and prevent them from counterattacking against you. There's Flint Golem. It's a 2/3 that when it becomes blocked, the defending player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. So this is, in fact, a version of a Millstone, just as there had been a version of Black Vice and Rack. This one is a sort of Millstone version of creature that when it becomes blocked, it basically mills away at your opponent's deck. So they either block it or take some damage. Flowstone Overseer. It's a 4/4 for 2 red. Target creature gets +1/-1 until end of turn. So the thing is, this is Flowstone taken to the extreme degree, because not only does it affect itself, it can affect any creature in play. It is a way that you can, in fact, Flowstone something to death if you have enough red mana, reducing its toughness to 0 and therefore killing it, but it's also a way that you can boost up any of your creatures with it. So it had a lot of uses in a deck. Laccolith Titan. The ultimate example of Laccolith. This is a 6/6 Laccolith, so it's very powerful. So if it should become blocked, of course it has this ability where it can deal damage equal to its power to target creature in play. And after that, it deals no combat damage this turn. Meaning it has an ability, the Laccolith ability, which is faster than First Strike because it's as soon as it's blocked. Not before damage is dealt. As soon as it's blocked, it can choose to do this damage. It won't do combat damage afterwards, but it could possibly kill the creature that's blocking it just by Laccolithing it, or killing something else that maybe you don't want, any other player doesn't want in play. There's Lin Civi, Defiant Healer. Now this is the ultimate example of a rebel card. For X, you can search your library for a rebel of a casting cost of X or less and put it into play. So similar to what they had in the previous set of Mercadian Masques searching for rebels, this is the ultimate example of one of them since you can search for X. Also for 3, you can put a rebel card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. So effectively you could put rebels back and then search and put them back into play. Very good card. Mog Catcher. This is the rebel or mercenary that would search for another creature type. This one for 3 and tap, you could search your library for a goblin and put it into play. So if you had a goblin-based deck, Mog Catcher was really good to have. Nesting Worm. 4/4 trample. This is like the ultimate example of those search for more copies of them cards. This is the big creature for it. You can search for up to 3 copies of Nesting Worm when you play them into play. It's really good like that. Pack Hunt. This you could play on a creature and it basically gives them that effect. It gives them the effect I just talked about with Nesting Worm. You can search from up to 3 copies of target creature that you're targeting with this spell from your library, reveal them and put them in your hand. So this makes any creature you have in play effectively have that ability. Then there's Parallax Nexus. It has Fading 5, but you can choose to remove a Fading counter from it to have target player remove a card from their hand from the game. As soon as the Parallax Nexus leaves the battlefield, then any cards that were removed from the game using it are returned to those respective players' hands. So it's a way that you can sort of remove cards from an opponent's hand, or maybe even from your own hand if you had a combo with it, for a limited amount of time. There was Predator Flagship. This is a legendary artifact. For 2 mana, you can give target creature flying, but for 5 mana and tapping it, you could destroy a creature with flying. So if you had 7 mana, you could destroy pretty much any creature, or you could at least keep control of the skies, so to say, keeping flying under control. Rath the Assassin, which I talked about being the previous card. It could, for a colorless and 2 black, you could destroy target tapped non-black creature. Effectively, you could use a bunch of mana and kill off things very efficiently. But for 3 and tapping it, you could search your library for a mercenary of converted mana cost 3 or less and put it into play. So it had some of that mercenary abilities as previously, but it also had an ability to kill creatures. There's Rocks. This was another creature with the kind of strike-through ability, that when it would become blocked, you could have it deal its combat damage to the defending player as if it was not blocked. But this one had a unique ability that for 2 colors and a green, you could regenerate it. So unlike other ones before, this 4/4 was actually kind of deadly because you couldn't get rid of it as easy. Seal of Doom. Seal of Doom was one of these seal-type cards. This one, you could sacrifice it to destroy target non-black creature. It can't be regenerated. So it was effectively like a Terra-like effect in enchantment form. Skyshroud Behemoth. It is a 10/10 with Fading 4 that comes into play tapped. It was a very big creature, very powerful, and it actually was pretty cheap casting cost for something that big, but it had that fading effect, meaning that it was getting rid of itself very quickly right away. Skyshroud Claim. You search your library for 2 forest cards and put them into the battlefield. It was a really good search for land cards for green in particular. Stampede Driver. For 1 green and 1 colorless, you could tap him, discard a card, and give all of your creatures +1/+1 and trample until end of turn. So it's very similar to Overrun, which is a card that is pretty out there that gives everything +3/+3 and trample. This was a lesser effect of it that you could change any card into this effect. So effectively, you could be like, I give all my things trample and +1/+1 until end of turn. I'm ready to just smash into my enemies. Volrath the Fallen. We now have a card for Volrath. He is a 6/4, and for a colorless and a black, you could discard a card from your hand, and Volrath the Fallen would get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is that card's converted mana cost. So you could easily, with enough mana and enough cards in your hand, pump up Volrath to be very big by discarding cards to him. So that's it for today. I introduced you to Nemesis, the second set in the Mercadian Masques block, and it had many interesting cards which are still popular today that have come out from it. It had a lot of uses in the cards that were in it, and it showed itself to be the most powerful of the sets of the Mercadian Masques block. It also continued this storyline that's ramping up for the invasion, because the invasion, that takes place next on the blocks. That's the one that comes after this, and we can see what's happening in these various worlds setting up for that. So if any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please just leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows your support for the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. If you want to check out some more magic work, I can recommend Card Bazaar, They Said, We Said, and Tasty Snackies, some friends of the multiverse of my own. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.